a special report on the election 2020 and some of the Trump lawsuits. As always, we are so pleased to be joined tonight by Quick Hits News legal analyst Ken Del Vecchio. Ken, first of all, how was your Thanksgiving?
It was fantastic. Handled it down in Florida, and I'm still here in Florida, even though it might be saying Ridgewood, New Jersey. So I got to spend some time with, of course, my son Mario, my wife Francine, but my best female friend from law school, a top attorney down here, Anne-Marie Janusa, and it was a great time.
Awesome. Well, I want to encourage everybody to send us your questions through Haps or Twitter or Periscope or Facebook, all the rest. We've got the comment section is going to start filling up. Ken, we're talking about the news today. The states of Arizona and Wisconsin have both now certified their results, declaring Joe Biden the victor by about 10,000 votes in Arizona, 20,000 votes in Wisconsin. First of all, your reaction to this?
I think it's absolutely meaningless with these states certifying election results. They're largely partisan actions. It's the lowest level of scrutiny that's going to occur in this matter. It's going through the state legislatures now. Right before I got on, I was watching live the state legislature in Arizona with the Trump legal team, not really debating this, but just talking about all the election fraud that they feel is evidenced to have occurred. And this is going to go through the courts. And I have to say, it's really, I wouldn't call it completely meaningless, but it's akin to meaningless what the lower courts are saying, because as I mentioned a few weeks back, this is all going to ultimately be decided by one court, 9 justices, the United States Supreme Court of America.
Well, I want to play for you something that Jonathan Turley said on Fox News, because let's acknowledge there have been, and look, when the media says there's absolutely no evidence of fraud, I'll be the first to say that that's bunk. There have been some episodes, some instances where vote counts have been miscounted, where there have been rules that were not followed, where there have been seeming to be overcounts and undercounts and that sort of thing. But Jonathan Turley on Fox News actually made the point this morning that even if you add up all of this sort of instances of fraud, it still doesn't come close to the vote margins in some of these states. Here's what Turley had to say, and I'll get your reaction to this. Watch.
The problem is that there's this disconnect between the evidence and the relief being sought. You know, they've shown irregularities. They've shown unlawful orders. They've even shown thousands of votes that were not counted. But they haven't amounted to the type of numbers that would change the outcome in a given state. But more importantly, these judges have balked at the idea of essentially negating millions of votes as a form of relief. And in Pennsylvania, the court said, look, these voters do appear to have been denied their right to vote. I'd rather count their votes than to not count millions of others. And that's the disconnect that he's facing. The problem is that
fair to say, Ken, that there is a disconnect, and that right now, at least the courts keep saying, "Okay, you've given us some evidence, but it's not enough evidence to reverse these vote margins."
I disagree with Jonathan Turley in basic principle that there's not enough. Right now, we're going through the discovery processes in the courts. The discovery processes allow more evidence to be overturned. But if people read these complaints, there are mountains of evidence that are attached to them. Let's look first and foremost about how this entire election can be overturned. It all boils down to the Dominion and Smartmatic hardware and software. These voting machines appear to have been tainted. The attorneys that have filed the complaints and the expert reports they have attached to the complaints show that there indeed has been massive election fraud. Let's just talk about a couple of points, and this is undeniable that this is being alleged. Whether or not the ultimate evidence will support it, that remains to be seen. So let's break it down. In Georgia, in Michigan, and in other states, you have evidence of 100,000+ votes in certain circumstances, all being in a row for Joe Biden, where there's 0 for Donald Trump.
That is not all in a row. The splits in some of these was 90-10. And the point that a lot of people in these urban areas and cities would make is that, of course, African-American precincts in urban cities like Atlanta, like Detroit, like Pittsburgh, like Philadelphia, of course, those urban areas are going to go 90-10 for Joe Biden over Donald Trump, because that's what the African-American vote said they were going to do in all the exit polls and all the polling leading up to the election. But keep going.
That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about where a dump of over 25,000 in one incident, over 100,000 in another incident, votes in a row for Joe Biden and 0 for Donald Trump in one big clump. That, if that occurred, what it is being alleged, and if that occurred, that is a statistical impossibility. Also, I'm hearing that in numerous different jurisdictions, there are exactly, for example, 69%. I'm not saying that number. I'm saying as an example, there's exactly 69% votes for Joe Biden and exactly 31% for Donald Trump in numerous different jurisdictions, in tens of or hundreds of thousands of votes. If that happened in numerous jurisdictions, exactly 69 to 31 or exactly 67 to 33, the exact same percentage split in numerous jurisdictions in tens of thousands clumps of votes, that is a statistical impossibility. If these things occurred, then the Smartmatic and Dominion voting machines and software clearly have been rigged, and that will overturn this election. The evidence has been alleged in these complaints. There are expert reports. I've watched it with my own eyes, listening to varied experts who have been investigating Dominion for years, stating that this occurred. The courts are going to unravel this. Bottom line, if that happened, this election is getting overturned. But if you want to talk about the different piecemeal things that Jonathan Turley was speaking about, I can get into several of those and show how they can add up to the.
Well, let's talk about Dominion, since you bring up Dominion, and most of the Georgia voting machines were Dominion, and you had the president's former head of cybersecurity, whose job it was to protect infrastructure, technology systems at nuclear power plants and on election systems in all 50 states. He went on 60 Minutes last night, and he said that they spent 3.5 years gaming out every kind of hack imaginable, from overseas, hacks of the software, hacks of the hardware, hacks on election day, hacks before, new code that's written out. And he said that the solution that they came to for all of this, which was the solution that they implemented, involved paper ballots. Here's what he said. Watch.
Paper ballots. Paper ballots give you the ability to audit, to go back and check the tape and make sure that you got the count right. And that's really one of the keys to success for a secure 2020 election. 95% of the ballots cast in the 2020 election had a paper record associated with it. Compared to 2016, about 82%.
And with a paper record, you can go back and verify what the machine is saying by physically counting the paper.
That gives you the ability to prove that there was no malicious algorithm or hacked software that adjusted the tally of the vote. And just look at what happened in Georgia. Georgia has machines that tabulate the vote. They then held a hand recount, and the outcome was consistent with the machine vote.
And that tells you what?
That tells you that there was no manipulation of the vote on the machine count side. And so that pretty thoroughly, in my opinion, debunks some of these sensational claims out there that I've called nonsense and a hoax, that there is some hacking of these election vendors and their software and their systems across the country. It's nonsense.
Ken, your reaction?
What he's saying is not accurate. I completely agree. What he's saying is not accurate with regard to that this is evidence that there wasn't voter fraud, because there is coinciding evidence that there were gigantic ballot dumps, gigantic stuffing of ballot boxes. There's evidence that these ballots are fraudulent. There's evidence that there's watermarks that are missing on hundreds of thousands of ballots. There's evidence that...
So let me stop you right there. In order for there to be ballot stuffing, so you're suggesting that not only the ballots were stuffed, but they were stuffed in such a way so that somehow the machines would then also create a paper trail for every one of these ballots, extra ballots that was added?
You just identified what could have occurred. That's one possibility, that the machines themselves could have generated these ballots. They could have printed them out simultaneous with internet messing with them or thumbnails being put into them with algorithms. It could also be that the ballots themselves were delivered in big boxes and big bags and things like that. There's lots of evidence of that. There's evidence in Georgia, first of all, that there was a false claim of a water main break. Poll watchers and poll workers were told to go home. Oh, but guess what? While all the Republican poll watchers went home, until way after 1 a.m. in the morning. Several of the election workers stayed unsupervised. Who knows what could have occurred there?
Right. Who knows? And I guess the question that a lot of people are trying to understand, Ken, is if in fact this did happen, how come it hasn't been enough? How come that none of the judges, the federal judges that have looked at this, either haven't seen the evidence or feel that the evidence is so minuscule that it doesn't convince them to do anything except reject the Trump lawsuits?
I'm unmoved by what certain judges are saying about this. Many judges, if not the vast majority of judges, have political leanings and biases like nearly every other person in society. Doesn't mean that they're bad people, but they have outcomes that they want. Now, that doesn't mean, again, that just because a judge has an outcome that they want, that they'll necessarily force that outcome. However, in this type of circumstance, I have a lot of speculation and concern regarding why certain Democrat-appointed judges are just throwing out these cases. And at the end of the day, I have to keep explaining it doesn't matter because either side is going to appeal it, and this is going to go to the United States Supreme Court. But taking a step back, there is 100% concrete evidence based on what I've read with my own eyes and based on what I've watched with my own eyes that these Dominion machines were created in a manner that not only facilitates fraud, but was for the purpose of fraud. They can be intercepted via the internet. They can be utilized by putting in things like thumbnails, and they can be directed to change votes from Trump to Biden. From Trump to Biden, and or to just give votes to Biden. Regardless of what
60 Minutes just had the broadcast with the guy who spent 3.5 years looking at this. He's a Republican who worked in the Bush administration. He was a Trump appointee. He worked with Dominion to make sure that this wasn't the case, that there was no possibility for them being hacked. What would be the motivation of this Trump appointee to be part of some sort of vast conspiracy to somehow undermine Donald Trump?
I have absolutely no reason to believe that the guy that was on 60 Minutes, who I did watch last night myself, was part of any conspiracy. I'm not at all purporting that he was part of some conspiracy. What I am saying, though, is that he's incorrect in his analysis. It doesn't mean anything to me that he's a Republican. It doesn't mean anything to me that he was part of a Trump administration. There are thousands of bureaucrats and people who are appointed even to the Trump administration who are Republicans who absolutely do not have the interest of Donald Trump at heart, and they come to conclusions that they would like to feel. The evidence, however, does not match what that gentleman is saying. I'm not saying that he's lying. I'm not saying that he's purposely trying to mislead. What I am saying, though, is that he's incorrect and it's nonsensical what he's asserting. There is plenty of evidence that these machines were tampered with via the internet electronically. And whether or not there are ballots that are in paper form that are purported to match what the election results are, turns out to be irrelevant for multiple reasons. Because there's equal evidence out there that the ballots themselves have been either fabricated through the exact same process. It's very simple. It's literally like pushing a button, and 70% of the votes will go to Biden, 30% will go to Trump. They come up there electronically and they get printed out in ballots. There's lots of
question for somebody who wants to know, Standable, who wants to know what would it take, and I just put it on the screen. What would it take you to convince you that more than 80 million people voted for Joe Biden?
I don't believe it because the evidence is not supporting it. I am not 100% certain at this point that this election was rigged. However, I was speculative at the very onset when I saw that votes for Donald Trump in being heavily handed down for him to be in the lead by hundreds of thousands overnight turned into leads for Biden. I understand the argument that Joe Biden had higher vote counts via mail-in votes, and that's why it occurred. But that's all too convenient. When you match it up with these
one part of the argument. The other part of the argument, and I can tell you this from decades of covering national elections, that for whatever reason in our country, urban cities, particularly Detroit, Cleveland, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Milwaukee, Atlanta, for whatever reason, the African-American precincts in urban cities are almost always the last to come in these states. And it clearly, and it wasn't surprising to me when we found out that, okay, Milwaukee, the city of Milwaukee had not reported as of 1 a.m. After election day. In other words, the election morning. Same thing with Detroit. Same thing with, it was no surprise to me that none of those votes had been counted. And I thought, okay, well, once they do come in, you're going to see a swing. You're going to see a swing from a Trump lead to a Biden lead, particularly when you look at the number of votes that would come in from, say, a city of Detroit where you had, 250,000 votes that came in for, that were cast that had not been counted as of 2 a.m. And of course, they were going to come in 90-10 for Joe Biden. And of course, it was going to, when you have that kind of margin with 250,000 votes, of course, it's going to swing from a Trump slight lead to a Biden lead.
But look, you make a very valid point. I've seen the same thing as an onlooker over the years as a political analyst and a legal analyst. However, the degree of the shift was so dramatic that when you couple that with, for example, in Georgia, there were 96,000 mail-in ballots, absentee ballots that were requested and counted, but they were never recorded by the Board of Elections of actually being received. There's expert analysis that demonstrates that at least all those 96,000 votes were illegally counted. When you add that in connection with that, all these Republican poll workers were disavowed and not allowed, and then big, massive amounts of votes came in overnight, it adds up to me that there was election fraud. I mean, the list of types of fraud just goes on and on and on. What about the fact that there was 3% of votes that were discounted in the past, but 0.03 were discounted this year, meaning that usually a whole bunch of ballots get thrown out for all kinds of irregularities, but not this year. What about that you can't match the signatures in so many states like Georgia? The envelopes are either discarded or they're just not allowing us to go in and look to see.
Those are very valid points. And I agree that the number of reject ballots was much lower this year. And yes, you had ballots that normally don't get counted because of a lack of signatures that were counted this year. But the judges that have looked at this so far, at least in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, have said that even if you count all of those votes and give them to Donald Trump, it still doesn't come close to changing the outcome.
Look, I totally agree that if you're going to go off of the first real legal argument that we heard in Pennsylvania, that hey, it used to be that by 8 p.m. election night, all the votes had to be in. The Pennsylvania State Supreme Court acted illegally under the Constitution and did the job of the state legislature and changed that till 3 days afterwards. But those votes were segregated. They weren't counted, or the total number of those votes don't change anything. If you add that up with the dead people who voted and the people who moved out of state who voted, cobbling them all together doesn't overcome Joe Biden's victory total. If that were just the case, I would say that this election is pretty much over. But it's not just the case. There's so much more. When you have over 700,000 votes that were counted in Philadelphia alone, where Republican poll workers weren't allowed, when you have all these votes where signatures aren't being verified, when you have all these votes where they're postmarked later, you can't read the postmarks, when you have all these votes where you get 100,000 in a row for Joe Biden and 0 for Donald Trump and multiple circumstances of that, you start adding all these things up, and it's undeniable, at least to me, if all this evidence is accurate, if it is all accurate, that there was election fraud to the degree that easily overturns this election.
Here's a good question that's related to all of this. We'll put it actually on the screen, which is something I've now learned how to do, so I can actually read it. And Grogger says, can you ask him why all of the Trump lawsuits hold no merit with courts? So again, with all the sort of litany of things that you've cited, how come none of that has presented even a single positive ruling for Donald Trump?
All right. I'm going to put on my hat as a former judge, and I'm going to put on my hat as somebody who is the author of some of the best-selling legal books in the country, like the ones behind me. And I'm going to answer like this. It is irrelevant what lower court judges are ruling. And most of the lower court judges that have been handling these cases come from one side of the aisle, and they're just coming down on party lines on this. By the way, not
Well,
every
actually,
court, but
actually, I got to correct you there because there have been appellate courts that have also now looked at this, and there have been clear Republican judges. For example, one of the key judges in Pennsylvania, yes, he was appointed by Barack Obama, but he was appointed at the recommendation of the Republican senator. It was sort of a twofer. So there was a Republican judge that was nominated and confirmed. There was a Democratic judge. He was the Republican judge, longtime member of the Federal Society, and he was the one who a week ago rejected the Trump lawsuits. And then there are also the appellate courts. I mean, the appellate courts could reverse what a district court has done.
yeah, I'm sorry, but I'm just not swayed at all in terms of my analysis based on the lower court judges, which, by the way, are people who hold very high positions, who are respectable. However, I'm just not moved by what they're deciding in these cases because, first of all, they are not in receipt of all the evidence. This is at the very infancy of cases. Yet, many of these different lawsuits have hundreds of affidavits, have experts' reports connected to them, and show concrete evidence that I believe that when it's ultimately reviewed by the Supreme Court, that there's a very good chance these election results are going to turn. And by the way, keep in mind that the state legislatures are reviewing these matters too. And they're coming down, it seems, very much on the side of Donald Trump's cause in Pennsylvania, what I was just watching in Arizona. And they can make decisions that can change the outcome of this election as well.
There's another question I'm going to put on the screen, and it is from, let's see, something or other. Hopefully you can get to this question. Does Kenneth believe that electoral fraud happened for congressional races, or is this only about Trump? How do you explain the difference between, the Democrats doing so badly in congressional races, and yet it doesn't seem like it was sort of, well, go ahead, answer the question from there. I'll let you take it.
Simply because the motivation and the act was put in place just to rig the election against Donald Trump. It doesn't mean that there wasn't some election fraud in the congressional races as well. There's election fraud in nearly every election that occurs. The question is there enough election fraud that can overturn the election? And clearly there was a designed effort to have mass election and voter fraud in favor of Joe Biden.
We're talking to Ken Del Vecchio, and lots of comments from people online. Hello, Peter. Hello from Seattle. State legislatures can do anything. That's true. All swing states have been certified. No, actually, no, not all the states have been certified. I believe Georgia's coming Wednesday. And speaking of Georgia, since we got this I'm having machines being hacked and possible problems with the Dominion machines. And here's what he had to say about it. Watch.
That is the great thing about our paper ballot system. It is auditable, it is recountable, and can provide voters the confidence that the outcomes are correct. Once this recount is complete, everyone in Georgia will be able to have even more confidence in the results of our elections. Despite the massive amounts of misinformation that is being spread by dishonest actors. There are those who are exploiting the emotions of many Trump supporters with fantastic claims, half-truths, misinformation, and frankly, they are misleading the president as well, apparently.
Ken, what would be the motivation of the Republican Georgia Secretary of State to be talking about ballots that can be counted and audited because there are paper ballots, and for him to suggest that the vote count has been solid in his state?
David, I don't believe in this guy. All of the reporting that I find on him states that he's like an anti-Trumper, and his motivation can very well be political. Maybe he doesn't have a motivation at all. Maybe he's just kind of silly, and maybe he doesn't really know what he's doing, or maybe he just wants to move on from this because he's committed massive blunders and he's trying to divert from his ridiculous deal that he made with Stacey Abrams to not have signature verification. The bottom line is, I don't know what his motivation is. And although I may care to find out, right now, what I'm most concerned about is that Georgia handles things in an appropriate manner. Like, I mean, here's a simple one. Why is Dominion fighting so desperately hard not to have their machines commandeered and check them and see if they were reset to determine if there was voter fraud? You know what they said the reason why that they're fighting this is because they're trying to protect trademark secrets. Yeah, trademark secrets that potentially allow voter fraud to occur that's designed for that very purpose. That seems to be what they're doing.
Ken, take us through the path. I mean, what is the path in terms of to the Supreme Court? What do you see in terms of having to be presented to the Supreme Court that would get them to do what no lower court, no appellate court has done so far? Lay out exactly what the Trump team would have to put in front of these 9 justices in order to convince them to say, no, we're not going to allow this election to be certified and have the electors move forward as they are currently planning to do.
Well, first, there's a major fallacy, David, that's being reported by so-called legal analysts and by different pundits in the major news networks that there's this undeniable time limit. There's not. The court can determine right off the bat to enforce an injunction, a temporary restraining order, to restrain the electors from voting, to restrain certifications from happening, to restrain Joe Biden from being able to take office if they feel that there's enough evidence there that makes out a prima facie case, that makes a cause of action. You're asking what that cause of action is that could result in the United States Supreme Court in determining that Donald Trump is the winner. Well, again, I'm going to just restate that if the evidence shows that there was massive voter fraud via the Dominion voting machines, it's over. And let me really explain this, because I'm going to really squarely answer your question. Evidence that's circumstantial and evidence that's direct can prove this. What is circumstantial evidence? David, you go to sleep tonight at 10 p.m. and you wake up at 6 a.m. and there's snow on the ground, but you never saw it snowing. When you went to sleep, it was totally clear night. When you woke up, there's snow on the ground. That is circumstantial evidence that it snowed the night before. If there are clearly 100 different jurisdictions across the country that have the exact same percentages of votes in massive amounts of hundreds of thousands or even tens of thousands of votes that are split in the same exact numbers between Trump and Biden, that is circumstantial evidence that is just as good as direct evidence of somebody coming up and admitting that there was voter fraud.
I agree with you 100%. I guess the question is, though, what is it that's keeping the Trump campaign, if in fact this evidence does exist, of putting together even, I don't know, so a PowerPoint slide to say to some federal court, some appellate court, or the Supreme Court, or the public for that matter, look at all of these ratios. How is it possible that the ratios could be the same in state after state after state? They haven't done that yet. And I guess I'm just sort of confused as to what are they waiting for, if this is in fact what happened.
I think, first of all, that people should read Sidney Powell's complaints that have been filed in Georgia and even more so in Michigan, where there's expert witness reports that are attached to those complaints that speak to this exact issue. And I do have to state, it's another fallacy that there's some kind of big mistake here or showing some kind of failure that the Trump team and Sidney Powell, who's now separate from the Trump team, don't have the evidence. There's major strategy reasons why lawyers don't reveal everything to the public and they reveal it to the court. There's also something called the discovery processes, that if you make out a prima facie case, that if you believe everything that the plaintiff is saying, that there is a case in layman's terms, then that case can't get dismissed under the law. And you allow the discovery processes to help build up that evidence, to do things like be able to inspect the Dominion voting machines, which I don't expect really to get anything from that, by the way. To get that kind of smoking gun is unlikely. If these people were savvy enough to fix it and get the kind of results that they want, they were savvy enough to wipe it out. It's just as easy to do that, but who knows? Maybe that'll come out. But also, you may get more whistleblowers to come out. And right now, it appears that there's multiple whistleblowers. The Democrats love the whistleblowers when it was a person who all they were doing was repeating something that they knew that was in a phone call with Donald Trump and a prime minister from another country. Now they don't want to hear whistleblowers that are saying that the company that they work for committed major election fraud.
Okay, what does it say if the Supreme Court, and then the appeal is made to the Supreme Court decides, you know what, we're not going to take this. Based on what we've seen, there's nothing there. Or if they do take it, they review it, and they still say there's nothing there, then that would mean that the evidence wasn't there, correct? Either the circumstantial evidence, the prima facie evidence that the Trump campaign hadn't done a job of convincing these justices that there's enough here for them to get involved. Is that correct?
That's a perfect legal analysis, and there's no argument from either other side, David. If it goes to the United States Supreme Court, it gets through the whole court system, the evidence is going to be presented. And if the evidence does not reach the level that shows election fraud, number one, the Supreme Court reviewing it and denying it will say a lot. Number two, just as much, just as important, at that point, guess what? The public's going to have all that information too, and they can come to their own conclusion if there was enough evidence. I do believe that the United States Supreme Court, in the form that it is right now with these 9 justices, will give it a fair look. And I believe that there is an extremely good chance that they will not only give it that fair look, but if the evidence is there, they will overturn this election.
And the question is when? I mean, when do you envision them giving this the fair look? When do you imagine the Trump campaign either petitioning the Supreme Court or taking lower court rulings, combining them and saying, okay, Supremes, I know everybody hates that in the law, but that's what I like to call them. Go ahead. It's time for you to get involved. At what point does the Trump campaign do this? Because obviously they got to do it before January the 20th.
Well, see, there's a couple different questions there. No, they really don't have to legally do it before January 20th. Meaning the court doesn't have to really make that decision before January 20th in pure legal terms, because the Supreme Court can decide whatever they want. They can decide that they're going to restrain Joe Biden from taking office, that they're going to restrain the Electoral College and extend the amount of time to have this case heard so that they can evaluate all the evidence. Now, practically speaking, that proposition is probably unlikely. I think the Supreme Court will muscle it through. You asked, how does the Trump campaign get it there? Well, unfortunately for the Trump campaign, just like any plaintiff, they can't just say, hey, United States Supreme Court, you got to hear this. It's got to go through the levels of the different courts, unless the Supreme Court just sticks up their hands and waves out and says, hey, we're going to take jurisdiction on our own right now. That's possible. All that said, I think that we're going to see a result of it getting in the Supreme Court's hands pretty quickly. And I do think that it will get there, answering your question directly, before January 20th. And I think it's quite likely, extremely likely, that they'll make a decision before January 20th. But I wouldn't be shocked if the Supreme Court said, whoa, there's just too much here. We need some more time. Donald Trump can sit in office still as president while we decide this.
But again, if you're not shocked, well, let's suppose you're not. Suppose the shot goes the other way, and that the Supreme Court says, you know what? We've looked at this. We've looked at the lower court rulings. We've looked at all the evidence that's been presented. We've looked at all the briefs that have been added to the lower court rulings, the appellate court rulings, and now we're not going to touch this, or we find no reason for us to get involved. Then that's it.
Well, something called a writ of certiorari is filed by plaintiffs or defendants when they're appealing to the United States Supreme Court. And that's what you're speaking about, that the Supreme Court could look at this and say, we're denying the writ of certiorari. We're not taking this case up, and we're not reviewing it. If that happens, that's very bad news for the Donald Trump campaign, because then they're not getting that ultimate review by the Supreme Court. And it's obviously quite indicative that the evidence is not there. I just don't think that's going to happen. I don't think it's going to happen because this is just too big of an issue that the United States Supreme Court would leave it to the varied lower courts to make these determinations. I think the United States Supreme Court will make these determinations, and I'm pretty confident, based on what I'm seeing, that the evidence is there, notwithstanding what the mainstream media is reporting, notwithstanding what social media is reporting, notwithstanding everything that seems to be out there, except for certain media outlets, many Republicans, and the state legislatures. If you're watching what the state legislatures are saying, it's very telling. They're getting the evidence, David. They're reviewing it. There's a very few people out there that really have all the evidence. And there's some of them that do. And it seems like that they're very much in favor of the notion that this was a fraudulent election.
Ken, it's always a pleasure talking with you. I, of course, disagree with you on a lot of things related to all of this, but when we talk about a lot of other policy issues and things across the board, people might find that Ken and I are actually in agreement on a lot of stuff, and both of our positions might surprise people who are trying to make some sort of judgment about us based on this one particular issue. In any case, Ken, if it's Monday night, it's Ken Del Vecchio night on Haps TV. Ken, always a pleasure to be on with you. Thanks for doing this. We appreciate it.
Always my pleasure to be here, David. And thanks for the great dialogue and opening my eyes on a few different things tonight as well.
Well, and I think what we've done is, if nothing else, is we've educated some of the folks out there, hopefully people who are open-minded both ways, as to what the legal process is, how it works, and what to sort of possibly, sort of expect in this process. And if we've done that with just a couple of people, then Ken Del Vecchio and I have been a success. Ken, thanks as always. I appreciate it. Thanks to everybody at Haps and Quick Hits News. Have a great night, everybody.